Hello, and welcome back to Now We're Really Talking. This episode is part one of a two-part conversation with Sally Orange, MBE. Sally is a former Army physiotherapist, mental health campaigner, and endurance runner. In this conversation, Sally shares her early experiences of mental health challenges and how entering the Army impacted this. In the second episode, we continue to explore these themes and move on to look at what she's doing now and talk about her recent cancer diagnosis. Before we get into the episode, a quick content note. This episode includes discussions of anxiety, depression, burnout, and mental health crises. Please listen with care and step away if you need to. If anything in this conversation brings up difficult feelings, you're not alone. Remember, support is always available. If you're in the UK, you can contact Samaritans for free, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on 116 123. Or if you're elsewhere, you can find a local helpline at findahelpline.com. Right, let's get into it. Sally, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really grateful for your time, and it's a real privilege to have you with me. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Paddy. Really looking forward to chatting to you.
Yeah, me too. And I've followed you on LinkedIn and obviously researching, seeing all the incredible things you've done. First of all, could you, to somebody you don't know, how would you describe yourself?
So, my name is Sally Orange, and that really is my name. Quite often people think because of what I do, I've changed my name, but I was born with that name. And for the last 22 years, I've served in the Royal Army Medical Corps as a physiotherapist. Unfortunately, I got medically discharged because of poor mental health. But I've sort of changed my direction really from being a physiotherapist into sort of doing more sort of adventure fundraising and sort of campaigning really for mental health, and more recently also breast cancer as well, because I've struggled myself with my mental health, and last year I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So in a nutshell, that's it. But I'm basically somebody who likes to say yes to things, so I've taken on lots of different adventures, be that voluntary work, and the different paths and avenues and networks that's created is really, really quite amazing. So that's where some of my story comes from, I guess.
Yeah, incredible. I think you summed it up there. But if we go back to the start, when can you first remember realising that mental health was a thing and maybe this was something that you were struggling with?
So it's actually probably going back to when I was 16. And at the time, we had a day off school, an inset day. They were called slightly different things. But we had an inset day, and I went ice skating with my boyfriend at the time. And I fell over and actually broke my leg quite seriously and ended up in hospital for a month and lots of surgery. And unfortunately for me, my boyfriend at the time went off with one of my best friends. And that really, really impacted me at a time where I was pretty low physically because I couldn't move. But then sort of emotionally and mentally, it really did have I suppose for me, it sort of planted the seed that you're not good enough, because I'd sort of been ditched for something else. But I like to see silver linings in things, and having broken my leg, I came across physiotherapists and found out what they did and decided that's what I wanted to do as a career, helping people when they were at their lowest physically. And so I then sort of set about doing my A-levels, and unfortunately I got my results, and I'd got places to go to university to go and study physiotherapy, but my results unfortunately weren't good enough. I'd missed a lot of time off school. So that looked as though that wasn't going to be able to happen. So I thought, no, I desperately want to be a physio. So I actually resat my A-levels, another whole year of study, really put a lot of pressure on myself. I have to get these grades. I'd already got, again, the places if I'd got the grades. And that second time I got my A-level results, and unfortunately they were even worse than they were the first time. And I think looking back, that was when, that exam stress, as it was called at the time, it was anxiety. I sat there in one of the exams in tears, and I just put so much pressure on myself because I had to get these grades. But obviously I didn't, but I got good enough grades to be able to go to university. And I started off doing a radiography course. But while I was there, I was like, no, I was doing my elective, my placement. And I just remember thinking, no, I want to be a physio, not a radiographer. So I actually ended up leaving that course and transferring onto another course later that would hopefully then get me on to the physiotherapy course. And I tell this story, in the actual fact, it took me 6 years to get into physiotherapy at university. So I suppose that's where my sort of determination and resilience, looking back, also sort of comes from. But I know through all of that time, back in those days, it was over 30 years ago. Back in those days, it was sort of thought of as, exam stress. But I had lots of problems, even during university, again, just not feeling good enough. And those rejections from university didn't help with my self-confidence. So I'd already got this narrative in my head, I'm not good enough, because my boyfriend had gone off with a friend, and then not being able, being rejected from university, and not just one. That was sort of, at the time, you could actually apply to universities and polytechnics. So that was 9 rejections every year for, sort of six years, until I got that one place that I finally got to study there. So I first applied in 1991 and finally graduated in 2000. But again, there's a really nice sort of silver lining again, that 30 years after I first applied to university to go and study physiotherapy, I received a email from the University of Nottingham, which is one of the universities that had turned me down for those 6 years. And that's where I ended up studying. And it said that we'd like to offer you an honorary doctorate.
Gosh.
So literally to have gone from, not succeeding, and that was for services to physiotherapy and mental health. So turned it round in the end. But looking back, it was, sort of 16. I mean, I was always an anxious child. If mum wasn't, if she said she was going out and she wasn't back at a certain time, I'd be at the window and, she'd get back and I'd be like, where have you been? I've been worried sick about, sort of doing almost the parent thing to my mum. So yeah, just, and it used to get called sensitive. And yeah, I am sensitive, and for a long time through my career as a physiotherapist, I felt that was a real weakness, being sensitive. But actually, as a physiotherapist, if you can read or feel somebody else's emotions, that's actually quite a strength, because you can tease out if somebody is in pain or if somebody is worried about something. So yeah, I just didn't see it at the time, and particularly in the army, it was never sort of seen particularly as a strength to be sensitive. But I think you can get lots of other things out of it, rather than not having any emotions at all and letting them wash over you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's so much in there that resonates with me, the kind of exam stress. And I was actually sat in this exact place a few years ago, and I had a breakdown before one of my exams, and kind of that overwhelming pressure I'd put on myself, connected to, thinking that those grades determined whether I was good enough. And actually, it's that your story of just perseverance, resilience to keep going through those years, and actually knowing that that's what you wanted to do and keep going. I don't know if I would have that in me. But you mentioned that you were struggling and it was sensitive, something that when I was at school, I was told I was too sensitive, and that was how the mental health challenges were brushed under the carpet. But did you talk about how you were feeling? Were you a talkative growing up about your mental health, or was it something that you kind of hid away?
I think I was very much heart on my sleeve to people close to me. So family, was very much talkative, but not externally. It was very back then, 1991. You didn't mention that you were struggling. And Eve, you mentioned there about, exams. I think for me, even the fact if something is caught, the soon as somebody says we're going to test you or it's going to be an exam, that I can already sort of feel, I feel myself sort of the beads of sweat and the fear. And surprisingly, driving tests. So for me, a driving test, it was a test, but it didn't determine my future particularly. It was something that I could take again and again and again. And I had that mindset when I took my driving test, and I passed it first time, because I just had this, well, if you don't pass, whereas I think with exams, it was very much, you've got to pass, and if you don't, and I was much more a coursework type person. I'd put the effort in and put the work in, and if something was coursework, I'd get good grades with that. But yes, I see that we're all different. But initially, no, it wasn't something that I spoke externally about until it got to the point where it was sort of recognised that I was going to need help.
And when was that point that you recognised that, or was it you who recognised that, or was it somebody else?
No, it was actually at university, and not the first time I went to university, but I think it was the second time I went to university that some of my lecturers, it was a much smaller university, or the course, physiotherapy course, there's only 40 people on there. So all your lecturers know you very well. Whereas my first degree, I was sort of, I actually went, come to think of it, I really struggled during my first degree as well, but I didn't tell anyone. That was really kept. I would go to the doctor and I was on antidepressants, but I think it was the second degree. I remember going to see the university counsellors, but being really ashamed about it and not wanting anyone to know about it, and just saying I've got a doctor's appointment or something like that. So yeah, it was at university.
And where did you go from there? So once it was recognised, did you get support straight away, and how did that support look?
Yeah, again, it was quite a long time, but it was sort of talking therapies. Actually, back in those days, it was just counselling. It wasn't, I've since done sort of CBT, compassion focused therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. So lots of different types of therapy. But for a long time, it was, it was just talking to somebody with no real direction of what they were. I guess it was almost a sounding board through the university. I think I then did do sort of transactional analysis therapy, where it was sort of looking at parent child. So lots of different therapies over time. But now I'm very open about the fact that I still see a therapist. I still take medication. I think I've been on medication now 13 years constantly, and quite ironically, last year I was doing really quite well, and I thought, maybe it's time to sort of come down off the antidepressants, which given that I'd just been diagnosed with cancer, probably doesn't seem quite the right time. And with the cancer diagnosis, I also had to stop my hormone replacement therapy, which then as a female, you've got hormones and menopause and all these sort of things going through you as well. And yeah, so I thought, well, I'll stop it. But then after my surgery, and I started having all these really hot sweats, and one of the cancer nurses explained to me that some antidepressants can help with the hot sweats. And I asked which ones, and when she told me, I was like, oh, that's the one that I'm on. So I upped the dosage to what it was previously, and I have to admit the hot sweats aren't as bad now. So I kind of see it as having a different reason for taking it now. But yeah, quite strange how, given that I was diagnosed with cancer, that I felt, still felt mentally, quite strong. And that diagnosis didn't really affect me in a way that it potentially could have done.
we'll come back to that a bit later, because it's really interesting, that especially the intersection between physical and mental health. And yeah, I'm on antidepressants. I have counselling every week, and both of them I have no plans to stop in the near future. I'm very happy with how I'm doing. Yeah, it's interesting to hear about university and when you first started to talk. And coming out of university, how did you end up, in the army as a physiotherapist?
Well, on my second degree, for the physiotherapy degree, I'd found out about the Officers Training Corps, and thought, wow, that looks amazing. You get to go and do lots of different things, and you got paid on a Wednesday afternoon to go and do these things. Meeting other people. I thought, wow, that looks amazing. But there was a selection process, and I ended up on the reserve list for the selection process. So again, not quite good enough. But luckily for me, somebody didn't turn up. You had to go on a weekend selection, and somebody didn't turn up on that Friday evening. And they'd rang me in the morning and said, somebody's not coming, so you can come along. So I went and went for the weekend, and was selected. And yeah, it was kind of from then really that it sparked that interest, that then finding out as a physiotherapist you could do that within the army as well. Now, initially I was actually a reservist, so I would still work in the NHS. Once I qualified, I would still work in the NHS, but on Tuesday evenings and on weekends I would do my drill training and the exercises. And then I got the opportunity not that long after I'd qualified as a physio to go full time, still as a reservist but full time, and I did that for 7 years, and got to go all over the world, and yeah, do some really exciting things. So yeah, that's how that sort of came about, really.
Amazing. And a question that just kind of came to me, you said, again, you're on the reserve list, and it took like 6 years to get to university. How did you manage to keep going and keep persevering when you had that feeling of not being good enough?
I think it's very much that, looking back now and realising that there's lots of different ways to end up at a certain goal or a certain destination. So, I always say to people, you can go along the motorway to get from A to B, or you can take the scenic route. And I certainly took the scenic route, but I had some amazing experiences at the same time, because I would say that with challenge comes opportunity. And if you have that type of mindset, and I in the beginning, I didn't necessarily have that mindset. I just knew that I loved what this job was all about. It, just seemed to encompass me with the helping people, and, being quite physical, and sort of, if I touch back to what you were saying about, your medication and your therapy. To me, it's very much like physical health and a physiotherapist, that, if you've got an injury, you'll go and see a physio, and they will probably give you exercises to do to help you get better. Now, if you're left for too long on your own, if you think about, in a gym, if you have a PT, you've got an exercise, list of what to do. You can fall into really bad habits, and you can think you're doing things right. But actually, when you go back to a PT, they might tweak it and say, well, you're not quite doing this right, or enhance it to sort of further you along. And that's how I see therapy, really. It's just like physiotherapy for the mind. Although we do physical therapy, as they call it in the US, physical therapy, it's exactly the same for the mind, and it's just keeping you on track. And the medication I see as like a pair of crutches that, you're given them quite often, earlier on, just to sort of, when you're in that real sort of crisis or stress situation, it can just lower things down a little bit, just settle things down a bit, and then you're in a position to be able to learn the exercises. Because when your mind is all over the place, it's very hard to concentrate on what the exercises are, what you're supposed to be doing. And I have an analogy here, whereas I often say to people that you wouldn't learn to swim in a storm. So if you imagine, a great big storm going on outside and somebody chucking you out and going, right, swim. Well, that's effectively what happens when you're at crisis point and you've never had any treatment or therapy. You just don't know what to do, and you kind of, splashing around, metaphorically splashing around, don't know what to do. But actually, if you learn to swim in a swimming pool with armbands, with safety, with people around there, you know exactly what to do when you're in that storm. And it's the same, I think, with mental health. If we learn those tools and techniques that can help us when we're calm and when we're, able to take things on board, we can use them in the time when we, it starts to get to that point where we're, getting on that slippery slope. And that's something that always sort of sticks with me, of just sort of going, yeah, you still need to do the breathing exercises. You still need to do the tools that you've learnt when you're well, and keep practicing them for the times.
It's such a great analogy, because I think I've been at events and people have asked, do you prefer therapy or medication? And my answer is I prefer the two together, because it does allow that, learning, and it makes me feel I've got that space to learn without having the constant thoughts. I have OCD, so the constant thoughts, and I can tame the beast a lot more when I've got that kind of confidence and I'm ready for it.
That's the same with crutches. And we, as a physio, you might go from 2 crutches to 1 crutch to, then getting, some people will need crutches or a stick, to help them long term. And there's nothing wrong with that. We don't see anything wrong with, in fact, we take care of people if they've got crutches or a stick, and we just sort of say, we go around them rather than barging through them, because it's that physical thing that says, oh, we maybe just need to slow down a little bit for this person. So that's why I really do liken it to physiotherapy for the brain.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And especially the falling into bad habits, and actually, the gym analogy is so good. And so you entered the army. How did that initially impact your mental health joining the army?
So, I mean, once I was selected, so I then when I look back, I wasn't particularly easy on myself. I then had the imposter syndrome that I'm not really good enough. And almost that because it was the reserves rather than the regular, I still didn't allow myself to feel good enough, even though I wore exactly the same uniform, was doing the exact same job, because I was there as a professionally qualified officer. And I think when I was younger, in the army, I was never somebody who was a sort of a natural leader. Yet there I was in this position as a physiotherapist, which automatically makes you an officer. So you're sort of put in a leadership role. And when I say that I'm not a sort of a natural leader, that's like maybe if you've got a group of people and you're sort of forming them up to go and do something. But actually, again, I had to be kind to myself and say, actually, Sally, you're a leader in a slightly different way. If you've got a patient and you're a therapist, you are essentially a leader to an individual, because you've got to gain their respect. You've got to, try and get the best out of them for them to be able to succeed and to be able to move forward. So I just still had this constant way of being able to, sort of say, oh, you're not good enough. And then even looking at the other physios thinking, oh, well, they're all, they're on a different level to me. I'm still here. And again, recognize now, this is 25 years on, recognizing actually what does make a good physio. I always had in my mind that the people who were, very good clinically, and they were able to do the manipulations and, and have the intelligence to understand, really quite complex things in the body. But in actual fact, if you haven't got those communication skills, you're not going to be able to use or get your patient to do any of those, the tools or techniques. So again, I think it's, when we say to people, oh, it was so successful, success is very different to different people. It's recognizing that every physio is different, and maybe you need to work with somebody else so that you can complement each other. I might be able to get somebody to do the exercise they need to do, but the other person can help them get the release that they need. And I suppose that's the thing, is looking at collaboration and not seeing that we have to do everything by ourselves, is one way of thinking of it.
I think it links back to exams, and you were good at coursework and other people might be good at exams. And actually you need all those different types of people, some who have got that really good clinical knowledge, some who can just inherently understand how somebody's feeling without any words. And actually that's what makes a team, isn't it? And when I think about leadership in the army, or when people do, you think about people shouting, but actually there's quiet leadership in getting somebody and not being flustered and knowing what you're doing, which it's really interesting you talk about. You were in the army for 22 years,
Yeah.
into you were medically discharged. When did that happen?
Yeah, so that happened in 2019. So I did in 2011. I actually did go to Afghanistan, and it might seem strange to some people, but that was sort of the highlight of my career, really, because I really felt that I got to have an impact and was working with soldiers who were, really severely injured. And a lot of people, because I say that I was in the army and because I was medically discharged for mental health, they automatically assume that I have PTSD, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, or post-traumatic stress injury, and or illness. And I don't believe that I do from that time. That time was a real enhancement for me because I was with other people, that I was around people sort of 24/7. For me, the struggle was more when I came home and I had to go back to being on my own, perhaps with other people who didn't always understand. I knew that was a potential trigger for me, so I actually planned in my time after Afghanistan to go to India, and help young people on projects. So it was learning how to manage what potentially was going to make a slippery slope for me. But yeah, then it other things. It was quite challenging being, well, a number of things. So being female, being a physiotherapist, which is a professionally qualified officer, as opposed to somebody who's been through the 44 weeks at Sandhurst. I had a 2.5 week course, so you're not a proper officer in that respect. I was single most of the time in the army, and again, that was, if you hadn't got anyone to bounce, a husband or anything to sort of bounce ideas off and those kind of things. So there was quite a few things that, putting them all together, I was also a reservist rather than a regular. So quite often these things were looked at, and so accumulatively they all had quite an impact. And yeah, I think it was 2013 when I really, really struggled and found myself under the crisis team. And that was more through a relationship breakdown, if I'm honest, but there was a lot of impact from the military as well, as I say, just those little things, and added into that sensitivity, and maybe not having that nurtured, but having that as a weakness. Again, I think it's maybe the leaders that I was working with. Some of them were excellent and were very understanding when I'd say I'd struggle with this or I'd struggle with that, but others were just not interested, in the slightest. And yeah, so 2013, and then it sort of deteriorated after that, and then it was decided that it wasn't the right environment for me, which, I remember taking on a challenge of wanting to do the Marathon des Sables, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is sort of 6.5 marathons in 7 days across the Sahara Desert, carrying all of your own kit. And I remember coming back from that, and I remember crying so I was tired, and somebody had a go at me, and I ended up crying. And they said, "Oh, you're not very resilient, are you?" And I just thought, gosh, I've just done, this huge physical challenge, which is probably why I cried, because I was so exhausted, that I'm seen as not very resilient. But now, again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and I'm able to look back, sort of 7 years on from not being in the army. And actually, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of the things that I do now if I was still in the army, because I think those seniors would sort of be, well, why are you doing that? Why am I not doing that? I get to chat to people of all different ranks, because to me, they're just people. But when you're in the army, everybody has a rank, and there's a structure that, if you want to speak to them, you have to go through them. And whereas now I can talk to, to anybody. And it's that talking to people and helping each other that can get you places. And that's what networking is. And that was what was so, I was told in the army, oh, you're just going above me, or you're going round me. And I was like, well, no, I was just talking to them. And then, so I hadn't realized what networking was until I found myself, sort of actually, people say, oh, you're a great networker. I just like talking to people and finding out, and, I'm interested in people. And so, have that connection in that way.
Yeah, that's why I do the podcast, 'cause I just like talking to people and learning about them. But I have so many questions. I guess they center around, from an outside perspective, for somebody who struggles. I think I'd struggle if I was in the army to open up. So kind of I wanted to ask about that. But also, you mentioned about being a woman, being a reservist. I think you felt less able to open up because you also thought that there maybe was a conception that because you're a woman, that you maybe didn't have the same resilience as men in the same position.
Yeah, I also distinctly remember one of the medical officers, sort of opening up to them and them saying, don't ever tell anyone, because you'll be out. And particularly as a physiotherapist, it was very competitive. As much as it was competitive to get into physio as a degree, it was very competitive to be a physio in the army. So it was almost a case of, well, if you tell someone, then you're going to be the weak one, and you'll be the first one out, sort of thing. So, but I feel, again, looking now, I had lots of other skills, sort of more rounded skills that, yes, maybe I wasn't so good at some things, but that's, as you say, that's teamwork. We can't all be really good at everything, and we all can't all be good at things straight away. It takes learning and development, and if you haven't got that person there to nurture, and I think, I used to say to people when I would manage them, how do you like feedback? Some people want to know everything that they've done right or wrong. Others are happy with, well, just tell me when, I've done something wrong. But I didn't always want to, it would have been helpful for me if I'd have been told about the things when I'd done things well, rather than somebody once said to me, well, you should know that you're doing okay, because I've not had to call you in and tell you you're doing anything wrong. Unless you know that that's their style, that can be very, very difficult. And I get a real, just to, even now, I'm working, with a team of people, and just to get that, oh, well done, I kind of go, oh, that, and I suppose it's that kind of serotonin boost that makes you go, oh, that's nice. And it just makes you feel, for me, it makes me feel valued and wanted and a part of something, rather than, times when I've worked with people and I'm really sort of working hard and it's just not really acknowledged. And maybe there's a responsibility on me now, looking back, maybe there's a responsibility of me to say, it would be helpful for me if you were able to, say well done, or, not necessarily for the sake of it, but just if I have done something. But that's how I work. That's how I work best.
Yeah, it's so difficult, because I have similar. It makes me so annoyed, like your story, and when I speak to other people, or you hear that, you can see that somebody, it could be so good and is so good in their own way, but just because they don't fit into how stereotypically a role is seen, or people should act in that role, or they don't have the particular requirements that other people think that should determine how good you are at the role, that people get cast aside. And I think it's a real waste, and really disappointing. Once again, thank you so much for listening to Now We're Really Talking. Remember to check out part 2 of this conversation, which will be out later this week. Remember, If anything in this conversation has brought up difficult feelings, you're not alone and support is available. Samaritans are available 24/7 on 116 123. I'll see you in the next one.